During his days on the street, Stephen had grown incredibly adept at evading larger pursuers. Most of the time, that was a good thing. But in this case, Elizabeth was on his side. She didn't spot the little mouse until, by sheer luck, she noticed a tiny form darting to the other side of the alley. He disappeared amongst the garbage bags, but now, at least, Elizabeth knew where he was headed. She rushed to the corner, intent on cutting him off. Stephen, however, had grown quick during his days evading those large pursuers. He had to be, to outrun rats and worse. The sidewalk beyond was a death trap, a moving forest of tree-like limbs, rising and falling, swinging forward and back, carrying great apes to and from home and work. It took an expert such as Peter to lead a country bumpkin such as Monster safely through the chaos. Stephen had the advantage of youth and his tiny size, as he darted in a convoluted zigzag path after them. Elizabeth, being unaccustomed to the patterns of great ape movements, was unable to continue her pursuit. Thus she lingered at the corner, crying out for Stephen to come back, but helpless to retrieve him. "Monster!" a tiny voice cried out, bringing the huge mouse to a sudden halt in his tracks.
"Stephen?"
Monster lunged aside, narrowly avoiding a two-dimensional fate under the soul of an oblivious great ape. What once was ordered and predictable became pure chaos as Monster lost track of the pattern of strides and focused instead on the tiny form chasing after him. Monster darted about in a panic as foot after giant foot surged around him. Eventually, he found his way to the relative stillness of a brick wall, head spinning from the living storm. Not long afterwards, little Stephen appeared beside him. Monster shot an irritated glare down at the tiny mouse.
"Stephen, didn't we tell you to wait with Elizabeth at the scale?"
"But you can't go there!" Stephen exclaimed. He pointed past Monster to a forbidding fence straddling the space between two storefronts. "You'll die!"
"Yes, I will," Monster agreed, "if you keep distracting me when I need to focus."
Stephen's chin quivered, and he looked at the ground. "I'm sorry." Monster sighed.
"You seem quite adept at navigating the pitfalls of this land of giants."
Stephen visibly brightened at the remark and looked up with a smile as he nodded.
"Good. Then I trust you can find your way back without me."
Stephen's expression immediately fell, his smile practically flipping upside down. Monster motioned towards the old alley.
"Well, go on."
Stephen looked at the ground, pouting, but didn't argue the point any further. He turned away, and he was off, darting back into the maelstrom of sapient limbs. Monster nodded with an irritated sigh, and turned around to continue on his way, slowly this time, close to the wall, where there were fewer feet to contend with. He did not see the little form dart back into sight the moment his back was turned, and scamper after him. Monster's relief was beyond measure as he finally slipped under the checkerboard tangle of wires that made up the fence. Peter, who had long since arrived, raised an amused eyebrow when Monster finally joined him. "Trouble?" Monster answered him with a low growl.
You could say that. The boy followed us."
Monster glanced past Monster with a chuckle. "So I see." Monster fell silent as he followed Peter's gaze, whirling around, his jaw dropping in a blend of shock and outrage.
"I told you to go back!"
There stood Stephen, looking quite ashamed, as if he'd just been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "I know."
"Well, why didn't you?"
Stephen shrugged. "I was worried about you."
"Worried about?"
Peter grinned. "I think he was rather brave, considering he didn't dare speak of this place just a few hours ago."
"Don't tell me you're taking his side."
Peter shook his head. "Not at all. What the young fellow did was very foolish." Winking at Stephen, he added, "but nonetheless, quite brave." Monster silently scowled from Peter to Stephen and back. After a time, he raised his nose to the wind and took a deep breath.
The smell of feline is strong here.
Yes, quite, Peter agreed. I believe we should find some cover. In the meantime, Matrix? The spider on Peter's shoulder squeaked. Would you care to do some scouting for us? Nothing too far, just a quick look to see if there are any cats about. Matrix saluted Peter and leapt to a handy wall. Up he scuttled, and then the spider produced a tiny spyglass. A moment later, he dropped back down to Peter's shoulder and chittered in the rat's ear. All clear? There's a good lad. At this, Peter turned to Stephen. Would you care to take the lead? Before Monster could protest, Peter added, It may have been quite some time since the incident. I doubt the location will be easy to spot. Stephen hesitated and then nodded. Peter winked to Monster and followed, much to the big mouse's annoyance. This alley stood in stark contrast to the other. The garbage appeared undisturbed by rodent hands. The dumpsters were closed and forbidding. There were no ladders to speak of here. The bags of garbage lining the sides of the alley bore the long slashes of claws beyond the scope of rodent-kin. Stephen's steps faltered as the landscape began to look disturbingly familiar. His nose twitched as he caught a whiff of something. He backed into Peter's stomach, giving a frightened yelp at the touch of the wall of fur behind him.
Quiet,
Monster cautioned. This is it, Stephen whispered, pointing at the ground in front of them. This is where it happened. Peter scanned the ground, the walls, and the dumpsters and trash bags nearby. Well, I don't see any blood. I suppose that's a good sign. Though if there were any blood, it would probably be gone by now. Peter whispered something to Matrix. The spider hopped down from his shoulder, scuttled over to Monster, and crawled up the large mouse's back, drawing an involuntary shudder from him at the sensation of slender arthropod legs grabbing onto his bare white skin. Peter then stepped forward and nosed his way between two trash bags. A few moments later, he reappeared a bit further down the alley. I say, Stephen, can you tell me where it was you hid? The little mouse pointed to a dumpster just to Monster's left. I see. About for how long, would you say? Stephen shrugged. I don't know. And you saw nothing more? Stephen shook his head. I closed my eyes. I was scared. Yes, quite understandable, Peter mused. Then I believe I may have found a spark of hope. Monster's ears perked up, and a look of intense disbelief flashed across his face.
You found what?
An opening in the wall, Peter explained. I'm afraid it was too small for me to fit through, but for a mouse of average size it may have been only a mild squeeze. Certainly the cats were rather eager to get at something inside. The hole is surrounded by scratches. Stephen visibly brightened with a hopeful smile. Really? Peter nodded. Indeed, my fine fellow. Glancing back to the wall, he added, It was dug through solid cement, meaning it must have existed for quite some time. Certainly long enough for your family to have discovered it, and judging by the time and tools such a hole would have required, why, it certainly lends some credibility to your paradise story. Monster rubbed his head with an annoyed growl.
Oh, this is nonsense. Do you mean to tell me you actually believe this talk of a place without predators?
A look of hurt flashed across Stephen's face as he glanced up at the large mouse. Well, not initially, no, Peter explained. But come and have a look. Then tell me you don't believe there's at least a chance. Matrix leapt down from Monster's back and scuttled up and over a trash bag, while the mice and rats squeezed between and under. On the other side, they found an opening just as Peter had described. It was small, as Peter had said. Monster, curious in spite of himself, set down his halberd and squeezed his way through. There was a narrow space, the outer brickwork on one side and a wooden wall on the other, and all around cloud-like pockets of pink fluff. Insulation, through which a small passage had been cleared. Well, Peter asked, what do you think? Monster grunted, yet as he started to back out, he was overcome with a terrible squeezing sensation.
I think I'm stuck.
Peter mused. I suppose you are rather large for a mouse. Well, let me see what I can do. With that, Peter grabbed onto Monster's feet and heaved backward with all his might. Unfortunately, being more of a thinker than a doer, all his might was not especially much. Stephen couldn't help himself. He burst into a mad fit of giggles at the spectacles.
"What was that?"
Monster barked.
"Who's laughing?"
Peter silenced Stephen with a warning glance and a shake of his head. "No one, sir. That was the mating call of the black-capped chickadee."
"The what?"
There came a sound of rattling from a trash can across the alley. Every eye not otherwise occupied on the other side of a slightly too narrow opening turned to the source of the sound.
"What was that?"
Peter patted Monster on the rump. "I recommend silence. It would appear we may have company." Peter emerged warily from the shelter of the garbage bags, peering out from the edge of their shadows, ready to retreat if necessary. Stephen, despite his fear, poked his head out from just behind Peter's haunches. He squeaked in fright as the trash can rattled again with movements inside. He hid his face as the lid was forced aside. Then two small hands curled over the rim, joined shortly by a flaccid snout and a pair of eyes that seemed determined not to synchronize. One took note of Peter, while the other swiveled about, scanning the alley, and eventually settling on Stephen. "It's nothing," Peter called back to Monster. "It's only Mr. Lorry."
"Me? Nothing?"
the weaselly mouse grumbled.
"You hurt me, Mr. Dane."
Michael Lorry, or Mickey the Towel as he was otherwise known, for reasons I'd rather not discuss just now, was far from harmless. However, he was no cat, and that was some minor consolation. "You're rather far from home," Peter observed. "What brings you to this alley?"
"Food,"
Mickey answered.
"Ever since the friendly lady came for dinner, there hasn't been much to go around. At least, not for the faint of heart. No one ever comes here, so the food is plentiful."
I see," Peter mused. "So, I take it you've been here for quite some time?" Mickey flashed a crooked grin.
"Only when I get hungry. It's dangerous with the Sons of Ivar, one eye on the prowl. Very dangerous."
Peter glanced over his shoulder to Stephen, and then back to Mickey. "I say, you wouldn't have happened to see a large group of mice pass through?"
"The boys' friends?"
Mickey leered down at Stephen.
"Yes, I saw them. I saw the cats circle around them and play. They batted them around like ping-pong balls."
He punctuated the remark with a sadistic giggle. "What happened then?" Mickey giggled.
"What do you think happened? I hid. I didn't want to be next. But I didn't have to see. Ivar One-Eye never leaves survivors."
Stephen's face turned red with rage, and he shook as he began to open his mouth. Peter, however, cut him off. "If you'll kindly notice, this young man survived." Mickey shrugged.
"Maybe. I only know what was left to pick over, and there was plenty. If the boy escaped, he was the only one."
At long last, Stephen couldn't contain himself any more. In a torrent of emotion, he blurted out, "You're lying! My family is alive! They found paradise, and they're waiting for me to find them!"
"Oh, yes," Mickey agreed. "Of course they found paradise, and someday we'll all join them."
He gave a manic giggle as he said it. Stephen frowned, his breath quickening. He turned his back on the trash can and rushed back to the wall. Peter watched the little mouse, a scowl growing on his face as he looked back up at Mickey. "Well, some of us will." He tipped his hat to the twisted mouse in a show of false courtesy. "Thank you for your time, sir." His tone, however, didn't carry even a drop of gratitude. Back at the plugged opening, Stephen dropped to the ground with a sniffle.
"I heard what was said,"
Monster remarked, his voice somewhat muffled. Stephen shook his head. "I don't care. He was lying. I know it." Monster growled softly.
"Boy,
You may have to confront some harsh realities. When it happens, it will break your heart. But if you harness that pain instead of rejecting it, you may grow stronger than you ever thought possible.
Stephen wiped his nose on his sleeve. Really?
It's what I did,
Monster answered. After a moment's pause, he added,
And that's why you don't want to be like me. It is painful, but you may not have a choice.
Oh, I don't know, Peter interrupted as he sauntered in from between the trash bags. The lad hid beneath the dumpster. It suggests there may have been an opening in the feline ranks. If he exploited it, who's to say the others did not? Monster gave an irritable growl.
Peter, you aren't doing the boy any favors building up empty hopes.
Peter shrugged. I hardly think them empty. I am not one prone to faith in empty tales. If I say his family may still be alive, it is because I see reason to believe it possible. Surveying Monster's trapped posterior, Peter added, Regardless, it seems to me we have other matters to deal with. Perhaps Ben might be of assistance freeing you. And good Bess is small enough to fit through, no question. I believe she may be of some help investigating. I propose one of us, me for instance, set out to fetch them.
Very well then,
Monster grumbled. What about me? Stephen asked. Matrix agreed, looking Peter in the eyes. Peter rubbed his chin. Yes, I suppose that does complicate things a bit. Glancing to the spider, he added, Perhaps you should go. Lead the others back here, and I'll keep an eye on things. Matrix raised a limb to his brow in silent salute, and then leapt to the wall and scurried away. Well then, Peter mused, leaning back against the wall, now we simply wait. He glanced down at Stephen, and a sudden rush of curiosity welled up inside him. I say, lad, what was your family like? Stephen gave Peter a confused look. They were my family. Yes, I realize that. Your father, for instance, what was he like? Stephen shrugged. He was my hero. He was tough and strong, and he could fix anything. Peter was silent for a moment. He stared intently into the blackness of the nearest garbage bag. Oh, Peter thought for a moment about his own father, assuming the mysterious rat had even been his father. Hero wasn't the word that came to mind. Well, what about your mother, then? She was nice, Stephen answered simply. She was beautiful, the most beautiful woman in the whole world. Peter mumbled. Rather a glowing assessment, I say. What was your mother like? Peter shrugged. I don't remember much. I was only a few weeks old when she was taken from us. My brother had to look after me. Glancing to the great white rump, Stephen asked, What about your mother, Monster? He was answered with a stone-cold silence. Monster? When Monster spoke, it was in a harsh rasp.
My mother is dead and buried. She no longer matters.
I say, it sounds like we touched a nerve, Peter muttered. Stephen fell silent for a time. Then he looked up at Peter and asked, What was your brother like? Peter gulped, pulling at the side of his collar as he suddenly felt uncomfortably warm. Well, it seems to me we should speak of other things for now. Yet none of them spoke again until Matrix returned with the others. It took the combined efforts of Ben, Peter, Elizabeth, and even Stu to pull Monster free. Ben took hold of Monster's feet, while Peter and Elizabeth tugged at a foot each. Stu, meanwhile, pulled with all his might on Monster's tail. After a great deal of time heaving and hoeing, Monster finally popped out of the opening with a sound not unlike the cork of a champagne bottle bursting free. He rear-ended Ben as he shot out like a cannonball, sending Ben flying with a crash into the side of a trash bag. Peter sighed with relief. I say, at last we can get down to business. Elizabeth poked about the hole, nose twitching as she breathed in the musty, dusty scent within.
What was Monster doing in there, anyway?
Rather a funny story, that, Peter began. He then launched into a long-winded explanation of the preceding events and a general outline of his theories and the proofs behind them. Monster, in the meantime, regained his feet and retrieved his halberd. Without a sound, he slipped away for some quiet and the chance to recover some small shred of his dignity. Only Stephen appeared to notice the large mouse's sudden absence. His ears perked up as he listened to the heavy, telltale footsteps of Monster's movements, and his nose twitched as he searched the air for the big mouse's scent.
So, you think this hole might have something to do with paradise?
Elizabeth mused. Peter nodded.
That's the short of it, yes. I was hoping you, or Ben, or perhaps you and Ben, might see where it leads, and see if you can find any sign of other mice.
Ben squeezed into the opening and looked about and sighed. "It's warm," he called back to the others. Elizabeth followed him in, and found this was indeed the case. A narrow passage led from the hole down the interior of a wall of great ape making. A strange pinkish fluff was packed tightly in, holding in the heat. Poking her head back out, Elizabeth asked,
Why do you suppose anyone would make such a tunnel?
Peter shrugged.
If I were to hazard a guess, I'd say it was to reach something at the other end.
Or to escape it,
Elizabeth mused. Ducking back inside, she continued along the tunnel, with Ben following at her heels. The fluff was strangely dense, as if beaten into a well-worn path over the course of many seasons of feet treading across it. The passage ended at a rough opening, chewed by rodent teeth into the side of a wall. As Elizabeth drew near the hole, however, her steps slowed. Her eyes watered, her mouth grew hot, and her tail stuck straight out behind her. Ben paused behind Elizabeth, looking her over curiously. "Is something wrong?" Elizabeth closed her eyes and took a deep breath.
No, not wrong. Just a little too right.
Her stomach rumbled like thunder as the smell of garlic and butter wafted through the opening to tease her nose. Elizabeth's eyes crossed and a moronic grin pulled across her face.
Italian. I love Italian.
Then the scent reached Ben's nostrils. His hair stood on end and his nose went limp. "Is it fresh? I've never had fresh."
The freshest fresh that ever freshed,
Elizabeth murmured. As one body, the two mice floated down the remainder of the passage, barely aware of their surroundings. They were utterly consumed by the beckoning promise of hot, fresh food. Yet as the two mice drifted to the hole, reality came thundering back in the form of a pair of gigantic leathery feet and an alien howl. Elizabeth had sense enough to leap back from the exit. Ben, however, did not. The two of them crashed into one another and collapsed into a heap.
Quiet,
Elizabeth whispered. Ben nodded, eyes wide with shock. For a time they listened, the delicious smells of the next chamber taunting them relentlessly, with promises of what the mice could never possess. There was a rhythm and order about the howling as the giant feet stomped back and forth across the chamber.
He's singing.
Elizabeth realized. With a chuckle, she added,
So great apes sing.
A little more cautiously now, Elizabeth and Ben poked their heads out of the hole and drank in the vision beyond. High metal altars loomed overhead, steam rising from their surfaces as great ape delicacies sizzled and popped against the heat. Giant baskets sat on countertops, filled with hunks of bread and what appeared to be a crumbly white cheese. Elizabeth slapped herself as she began to fall under the spell of the cheese.
Enough. You had enough last time.
"Cheese," Ben murmured beside her. Elizabeth glanced to her adopted son, and seizing him by the arm, yanked him back through the hole in the wall.
Well, we know where this goes. Mission accomplished. Now let's get back.
Ben didn't immediately react. He simply rocked back and forth, mumbling softly. Elizabeth rolled her eyes with a sigh, and grabbing Ben by the arm, she hauled him after her. Monster, meanwhile, had not gone far. He was simply out of sight, where he could breathe for a moment. Yet as he listened, he found a great swell of anger rising within him. His fist clenched, and he rubbed his knuckles against his teeth. He fingered the scars on his left shoulder. A very memorable set of scars they were. He was taken back to a time when he was much smaller, a time when he was grievously betrayed. He heard the sound of wailing, recalled the sight of a silvery flash, and felt the knife biting into his flesh. Monster took a deep breath to steady himself, and cleared his mind, delving into a place of silence and emptiness. He leaned against the smooth black plastic of a trash bag, rubbing his cheek against the skin-like webbing. He took deep, ponderous breaths, forcing his heart to slow, and imagined the heat radiating off his back, leaving him cool and dry. The sounds of voices drew him back to the moment. Elizabeth had returned. So came the time for Monster to rejoin the others, to hear what news she brought.
Well, we didn't get far. Let me do that again.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't get far.
Elizabeth was saying.
There was a great ape at the other end, fairly active.
Of course, Peter reasoned. During the day they would be about, but at night...
I think he was some kind of chef.
Elizabeth added.
I think he was cooking or baking.
Peter nodded, a look of intense satisfaction crossing his face.
So, we have a passage too small for a rat, leading to a source of food.
Monster couldn't help rolling his eyes to the sky, yet he bit his tongue. Time would reveal the truth of the matter.
I believe, Peter announced, the next step is to get a better view. From there, I can calculate likely places to search.
He flashed a hopeful grin.
Let us return to the scale. I believe that is our greatest asset right now.
Also a safer spot,
Elizabeth added. Monster trailed after the others as they set out for the open sidewalk and the relentless death trap beyond. Still, an oblivious forest of giant legs was preferable to a pack of predators actively seeking prey. A second straggler hung back with Monster. Not Stephen, who eagerly led the way with Peter, but rather a grinning shrew who had sensed Monster's displeasure. Stu eagerly drank it in, his eyes sparkling with mischief, never leaving Monster as the huge mouse trudged along.
What?
Monster finally blurted out.
Nothing,
Stu chuckled.
Just enjoying the view.
Given the chance, Monster might have asked what view that was. However, the end of the alley came upon them all too soon, forcing Monster to reckon with more pressing matters. The subject had to be dropped, as the little troop dodged and weaved through the ever-shifting landscape beyond. Back at the scale, Peter set to work with purpose and precision, a plan clearly forming in his head as he directed the others to one task or another.
"Matrix, lad," he asked first, "have you a rope to spare?"
The spider held up a well-sized coil in answer.
Uh-huh.
Peter, however, didn't appear satisfied.
I see. I tell you what, then. Climb up the building, if you please, and lower a rope down for us.
Matrix stared blankly into Peter's eyes for a time. At last he sighed and nodded.
And as for this coil,
Peter added, motioning to the rope Matrix had offered,
I believe something of this size would be sufficient at this end.
Matrix was utterly still for a time, his arachnid face impossible to read. At long last he let out a heavy breath, much like a sigh. With that, the spider leapt to the ceiling of their shelter, crawled out onto the roof, and set out for the brick wall beyond. The others stared aghast at him, all except for Stephen, who wore an eager expression as he waited to learn what would come next.
Peter,
Elizabeth finally spoke up.
What are you doing?
Peter, however, was now gazing at the ceiling, occasionally glancing down to their scale. At long last he spoke up.
I believe I have a job for one of you. Ben, perhaps.
Yeah, Ben answered. Peter sized him up a moment.
Yes, you'll do quite well. Fairly light, but tall enough to make up the difference.
With that, Peter clambered aboard the scale and offered Ben his hand.
Up you go, lad. There's a good chap. There's a good chap.
What do you want me to do? Ben asked as Peter hauled him aboard. Peter stared for a moment at Ben's arm, then glanced down at the scale, tracing its outline with his fingers.
I want you to chew a hole in our roof. I estimate about
20 cubits by 8. Ben blinked. What's a cubit?
Half an arm length, Peter answered, seizing Ben around the waist and raising him towards the ceiling. Yet as his face pressed against the cardboard, Ben hesitated.
What if it rains?
If all goes as I expect, that won't matter, Peter explained. Have at it. Just enough to slip out through, and then you can work on the roof.
Monster, however, wore a look of confused horror.
Have you gone mad?
Hardly, Peter answered. If things go poorly, we can find a better shelter easily enough. Now go on, lad. Wear down those fine teeth.
Ben glanced to Elizabeth out of the corner of his eye. Should I? Elizabeth's mouth dropped open, her eyes blinking as she hovered on the brink of a response.
We're going to need an opening to haul the scale through, Peter explained.
Finally, Elizabeth's mouth snapped shut, and she glanced down at Stephen.
Yes, do it.
Ben's eyes rolled to the ceiling. He hesitated for a moment, as if standing at the end of a diving board and looking into the deep end of a pool before taking the plunge. Then he began nibbling, shreds of cardboard peeling away and dropping to the floor as he went. When the opening was wide enough, Ben scrambled up to the roof of their shelter and continued his work from a more comfortable position. Matrix returned in time to see the spectacle, a rope trailing from a coil around his foremost shoulders. He watched for a moment, rubbing a limb against the back of his head, and then dropped down to the edge of the opening.
Hola! Ah, excellent, Peter remarked as he spotted the spider. I trust you tied it off somewhere secure?
Matrix nodded with a weary sigh.
Good, good. Now, if you would, toss down your end.
Matrix paused a moment as he worked through the jumble of Peter's words. Then he lowered the last of the rope into the box. Peter eagerly took hold of the bottom end of the rope and then looked over the scale. After a moment of thought, he fastened the rope around the front axle.
Now then, Peter announced, the time has begun to begin our climb.
Stu blinked.
Our what? Our climb, Peter repeated, to the roof of the building.
Stu paused, then chuckled uneasily.
Oh, y'all mean like the roof of our box or a dumpster or something like that?
Oh, no, of course not, Peter went on, oblivious to the shrew's mounting terror. The top of a great ape building.
Elizabeth forced a nervous grin. Her expression immediately fell.
Surely you don't expect us to... I'm afraid of heights. I get dizzy and...
Peter leaned against the scale, raising a quizzical eyebrow.
Well, that was the plan. I expect to search a rather large area, and it would be easiest, and indeed safest, if we stayed together. Besides, I seem to recall you climbing a rope much like this when we first met, and you were a fair deal heavier at the time. I should think this would be easy by comparison.
It's also a lot higher,
Elizabeth answered.
I see, Peter mused. Well then, would it be easier if you hung on to my shoulders?
Elizabeth gulped as she pictured the ground fading into the distance below her, and only her grip on the rat to hold her up.
No.
I can do it, Stephen blurted out. In a flash, he grabbed onto the rope and hauled himself up to the box's roof. Looking back down at the others, he added, See?
Yes, I see,
Elizabeth answered.
But this isn't just to climb up a cardboard box. You'll be going up the side of a brick building. Can you do that?
Stephen glanced over his shoulder, his nose rising up and up and up as he craned his neck. Then he smiled. Oh, wow! Yeah, let's do it!
Wait, Stephen, no!
Elizabeth exclaimed. Monster, however, cracked a smirk and chuckled.
Brave boy. He reminds me.
Monster's voice trailed off, and with it his gaze, sailing away together into the distance. Then he clenched the shaft of his halberd in his teeth, and taking the rope in both hands, Monster began climbing after Stephen. Peter gave a merry chuckle as he watched.
2 peas in a pod, those chaps.
Right about then, a large section of the roof simply caved in, flapping down across the scale's mast. Ben peered down from overhead. I'm done.
Very good, Peter answered, clearing away the shreds of cardboard. Now, if you could just climb up to the roof.
Ben blinked. I'm already on the roof.
Of the Great Apes building, Peter clarified. The brick one just behind our box. Ben's gaze drifted up the rope to the two shadows who had already put a fair distance between themselves and the ground. He glanced down to Elizabeth for approval.
Should I?
Of course, Peter interrupted. Here, let me show you. At that, he took hold of the rope and hauled himself up through the hole in the roof.
What about us?
Stu shouted after Peter. The rat paused a moment, looking back down. Perhaps you should ride on the scale. Stu glanced from Peter to the scale and back.
Okay, sounds good.
Stu,
Elizabeth muttered to the shrew.
the scale is going to tip back on the way up. It may even be worse than climbing normally.
Stu's beady eyes expanded to the size of dinner plates.
Hey, Pete, wait for me.
With strength uncharacteristic for his small size, Stu grabbed onto the rope and clambered up with his hands alone. Elizabeth gazed after him, her stomach twisting into knots as she contemplated the journey ahead. Yet there was nothing to do about it. The others were well on their way.
1 foot in front of the other,
Elizabeth repeated to herself. Monster's famous advice from when they met in the gorge one bleak summer day.
Just don't look down.
Elizabeth thought as she scaled the side of the building.
Don't look down.
This was easier said than done, for the climb was a long one and hard on the hands. Yet Elizabeth didn't dare let go until she reached the top. She lived a lifetime on that vertical journey. Her thoughts flashed from one memory to another as she recalled her moments great and small. Meeting her beloved Don Copper one spring morning as she sat reading by the village fire, rescuing 2 young children from the gorge and wrestling Monster into submission before she knew who he was, gorging herself on cheese in a frigid store, retrieving Stu from an amusement park he had run off to on some ill-advised quest for her affection. "Well done, Bess!" A large hand took Elizabeth's, pulling her out of her musings. As Elizabeth looked around, she realized she had made it. She stood beside Peter on a ledge overlooking the alley far below. Over the other side, in the shadows of a tall cement wall, she saw the others resting on what must have been the building's roof. It was flat and hard, much like the Great Ape's roads and sidewalks, but a few dozen feet further off the ground. The rope was tied off around a silvery pipe rising from the roof a short distance away. "Have a moment, everyone," Peter called out. "Then we bring up the scale." Ben's eyes rolled to the sky, and he fell flat on his back with a weary sigh.
I disagree, Monster spoke up. Once this is done, then we can rest, while Peter does his part.
"Why can't we let Peter do his part and then haul up the scale?" Stu complained.
Because then we'll be too tired to hold on when the time comes to fly it back down,
Monster retorted. Stu's face strained of color as he contemplated the alternatives.
Oh.
Monster nudged Ben in the side.
Get up.
Ben let out a mournful whine. Do I have to?
Yes,
Monster barked.
We're the strongest among us. Now, on your feet.
Monster roughly jerked Ben into a sitting position. Then the large mouse was off, dropping his halberd and clambering up the rope to the ledge. Ben rubbed his eyes and blubbered for a moment, but didn't argue the matter any further. "Matrix," Peter called. The spider poked his head over the ledge. "I'll need you to climb the pipe," Peter explained. "Loop the rope around each time I call out. That way we'll be able to take breaks without losing our progress."
What about the rest of us?
Elizabeth asked. Peter paused, glancing toward the pipe. "I say it is rather high. Perhaps you could help Matrix. Toss up the spare length of rope so he won't have to climb up and down every time I signal." Thusly the crew proceeded, with Peter keeping track of the excess lengths of rope as Monster and Ben hauled back on it. Lifting the scale, of course, was a difficult job. Peter occasionally tried to help, but only really managed to get in the way. Thanks to the work of Elizabeth and Matrix, however, the men were able to stop and rest their hands often.
By the time Monster dragged the scale over the side of the ledge, the sun had begun to dip towards the horizon, and shadows started to creep back into the city. Ben collapsed with a heavy breath. "Fire!" he gasped. "Fire in my arms!" Monster grunted in response, but otherwise ignored him.
Where should I leave it?
"It should be fine here," Peter mused. "I just need to raise the sail." Monster nodded, but hung on as Peter climbed aboard the scale to do his work.
I trust there was a reason we came up here?
Of course, Peter explained. "I intend to draw up a map of our search area. I needed a good view for that. I believe this rooftop will do quite nicely."
Monster grunted. Do you need anything else?
"Nothing at all, my friend," Peter answered, drawing a roll of paper and a rat-sized pencil from inside his jacket. "Go on and get some rest. You've earned it." Monster turned his gaze to Ben. The white lab mouse appeared paler than usual, and he wasn't moving. Monster smirked, choosing to let sleeping mice lie. Taking hold of the rope, he climbed over the side of the ledge and dropped down to the rooftop below. Yet as Monster rubbed his aching arms, ready and eager to put up his feet, he found another obstacle waiting for him. It came in the form of a low, sweet, but unwelcome voice.
"Monster."
Elizabeth huddled near the wall, motioning for him to join her. By the tone in her voice, Monster could tell she wanted something more from him. Monster neither wondered nor cared what the matter could be. Despite his exhaustion, he sauntered over to Elizabeth and leaned against the wall.
What is it?
Elizabeth motioned to Stephen. Monster followed her gaze to where the young mouse sat against the pipe. His mother's locket was out and popped open, while Matrix perched just above him, nodding as Stephen variously chattered and mumbled away to the spider.
What about him?
"I want you to talk to him."
Monster grunted.
We've spoken.
Elizabeth cocked her head to the side and raised a skeptical eyebrow.
"About what?"
Monster shrugged, settling into a sitting position.
I told him he had to confront some harsh realities. It would be painful, but he could harness it to grow stronger.
Elizabeth mumbled.
"Did he understand what you meant?"
Of course, why wouldn't he?
"If that's true,"
Elizabeth mused, sitting down beside Monster.
"then why is Peter still searching for Stephen's family?"
Monster growled softly.
Because the man's a hopeless idealist.
Elizabeth shook her head.
"Do you really believe that?"
Why wouldn't I? The world has repeatedly beaten him down. His own brother is a murderous madman, and yet he still goes chasing after fairy tales of a magical place where nobody has to live in fear.
"Monster,"
Elizabeth repeated.
"talk to Stephen. He needs a friend."
Monster sighed and closed his eyes.
He has friends. He has you and Peter, the spider, and even that blasted shrew.
"Maybe."
Elizabeth shrugged. Then she fixed Monster with all the grim intensity her eyes could muster, which you may recall was considerable.
"But he adopted you."
Monster's eyes snapped open, his brow furrowing into a look of discomfort and confusion.
Adopted?
Elizabeth nodded with a grin.
"He really admires you."
Now it was Monster's turn to wear a skeptical face.
Has he told you?
Elizabeth shrugged coyly.
"Not in so many words. No, but I can see it when he talks to you. Hear it in his voice and in the way he follows you around. I think he was trying to show off when he started climbing."
Monster blinked, looking down at himself. He gazed into his hands for a time, squinting and shaking his head.
Why would the boy admire me? I'm a monster!
"You're also his hero,"
Elizabeth explained.
"He's hurting, Monster. He needs to know you're on his side."
Monster glanced up toward Stephen. Matrix had just done something. Monster hadn't seen what it was, but it made Stephen laugh.
He doesn't look so bad to me.
The spider dropped down from overhead and tackled Stephen like a playful puppy. The two rolled about, Stephen giggling as Matrix tickled his face with the sides of his fangs.
"You wouldn't either,"
Elizabeth retorted.
"if you had a friendly spider to distract you."
She touched Monster's arm, drawing a look of intense surprise from the huge mouse as he felt her hand.
Talk to him.
Well, what would I say?
Just let him know you believe in him.
But I don't!
So, pretend you do.
I won't lie to him, Elizabeth. I can't.
Monster's voice trailed off, and he gazed into the distance.
I care too much to torture him with false hope.
Then tell him that.
That his hopes are false?
No,
Elizabeth giggled softly.
that you care. He's all alone right now, just like you were.
Monster sighed, letting it rattle his whiskers as the air came rushing from his nostrils. He stood up, cracking his neck as if he were about to fight. In a way, he was. He was about to fight with himself. Monster dragged his feet as he shuffled towards the pipe, taking his time, approaching Stephen as slowly as possible. The moment Stephen saw Monster, the little mouse shooed Matrix aside and hopped to his feet, throwing back his shoulders and thrusting forth his chest like a little soldier snapping to attention. A raspy breath rumbled from the back of Monster's throat.
Sit down.
Stephen immediately dropped to the floor. Monster paused for a time, very much taken aback. Then he cleared his throat and spoke again.
You can relax.
Stephen didn't appear to. Monster sighed and took a seat an arm's length away, just around the side of the pipe.
That was a brave thing you did,
He began.
climbing all the way up here, leading the way at that.
I wasn't afraid, Stephen lied. I'm not afraid of anything.
Then I envy you.
Monster fell silent for a time. Why? Stephen asked. Monster rolled his eyes towards the sky, but fought back the urge to growl.
Don't start that again.
Instead, he told the truth.
Because I'm afraid of everything.
Stephen crept around the side of the pipe, blinking in disbelief. Really? Monster nodded, suddenly feeling very self-conscious.
Don't you dare breathe a word of it to anyone, boy.
I won't. I promise. Monster relaxed a bit. He even cracked the faintest beginnings of a smile.
Thank you.
He paused a moment, looking up at the silhouette of Peter as the rat worked.
Show me your family. Please.
Stephen pulled his mother's locket from under his collar and popped it open for Monster to see. The huge mouse regarded the pictures inside. The smiles, the expressions. The father looked strangely uncomfortable, possibly a bit self-conscious, but the mother appeared perfectly content. The three children all wore broad smiles, as if they were the best of friends. The corners of Monster's mouth drooped a bit.
I see a great deal of love in those pictures.
Stephen nodded, his own expression quivering as he gazed at them. Monster's attention drifted to Stephen's face. The little mouse looked to be on the verge of tears. Monster set a large hand on the boy's shoulder.
Peter seems to think he can find them. He's a brilliant man, far smarter than I could ever be.
Do you think he will? Stephen's voice quivered. Monster couldn't help but wonder if the boy believed it himself.
If it can be done, Peter can do it. If.
Stephen snapped the locket closed and tucked it into his collar. Before Monster knew what he was saying, he could feel his mouth moving and air whistling through his throat.
It's going to be all right, boy. Stephen, I promise.
In an instant, Stephen slipped from under Monster's grasp and flung himself against Monster's side. The huge mouse flinched as the little fellow threw his arms as far around Monster's waist as he could manage. Monster blinked, glancing uneasily to either side. He couldn't let Stu see him like this. The shrew would think he'd gone soft. Yet Monster couldn't bring himself to shove Stephen away, and so he draped his arm across the boy's back and let him linger as long as he liked.